Good morning, everyone. Let's start our seminar this Friday. Today we will have Antonio Montero-Dorta, but to introduce him, I will first introduce you to a new postdoc at our institute, Daniela Palma, who is coming from the University of Atacama in Chile, and who works with Antonio. So I let her introduce him to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lert. Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to present the speaker today, Antonio Montero-Dorta. Antonio is from Universidad Santa María, Chile, and he is originally from Canary Island. He did his master's degree at the Instituto de Astrofísica de Canarias and then complete his PhD at the Instituto de Astrofísica de Andalucía. After his PhD, he held postdoctoral positions at the University of Utah, working with the BOSS survey, and later at the Universidad de Sao Paulo with Raúl Abramo. Since 2020, he has been associated professor at USM, and his research focuses at the intersection of galaxy evolution and cosmology, including halo galaxy connection, large-scale structure, cosmology, and statistical properties of the galaxy population from galaxy surveys. Today, he will talk about the multi-scale interplay between dark and luminous matter. So please, Antonio, go ahead.
Thank you, Daniela. Well, I should first, of course, thank the organizers for giving me this chance. Also, of course, Raúl for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here again. As Daniela said, I was here. I left 5 years ago already, but this is the first time that I come back after that. So it's very nice to see friends, so many familiar faces, and it's really cool to be back. Anyway, so as Daniela said, I'm going to talk about my main field of research, which still is the halo galaxy connection. Although it has some ramifications in other fields, I usually say that the halo galaxy connection sits at that interface between galaxy evolution and cosmology. I guess for cosmologists, we do galaxy stuff, we do galaxy evolution, and for people doing galaxy evolution, we are cosmologists. So I guess we lie there in between those two fields. But yeah, the idea is to connect not only halos and galaxies, but also the matter density field as well, from which all these objects emerge, and not only looking at the internal properties of these objects, but also their environments and clustering as well. Okay, so I usually start with this world map where I put the places where I've been, but this is just an excuse to illustrate what we do in this field, and I would say not only in this field, but actually also in cosmology and many other fields of astrophysics, right? If you see this world map, you can obviously make out and delineate the different shapes and silhouettes of continents and islands with precision. But of course, this is daytime. If you look at it, this doesn't really work well, but I think you get the message. If you look at it at nighttime, right? If this was really nighttime, you would only see, the vision that the light gives you, actually, which is a very biased vision of the actual structure that we see there in terms of continents and islands, right? Of course, bias is an important keyword for this talk and in this field as well. Okay, so obviously the same thing happens in astrophysics and cosmology, right? We basically have the light of stars and galaxies, but we want to go beyond that. We really want to understand the whole picture, and that's also coming from the matter, so the dark matter and the matter density field. Okay, so I'm going to start with an introduction that it might be a bit too basic for some of you, but it's probably good for some students. And you have to start with the lambda CDM, cold dark matter, concordance model of cosmology. That's our underlying model, okay? And this is, as you know, based on different elements and observations and probes. such as the CMB, large-scale structure of the universe, and all this we have been able to condense into several cosmological parameters, such as those that define the composition of the universe. And using general relativity, we know how this type of system will expand and evolve in time, at least assuming that it's homogeneous. Of course, there's a lot of open questions here that cosmology is really interested in figuring out. But in general, we have a good idea of that background cosmology in the universe. We know, of course, that the universe is not actually homogeneous, it's highly inhomogeneous, right? And the idea is that we have these tiny quantum fluctuations that originate in the early universe and then get amplified by this process called inflation. And later, due to gravitational instability, these fluctuations grow in time to form ultimately the large-scale structure of the universe that we can even observe today, right? In this field and also in cosmology, these fluctuations can be expressed in terms of this contrast with respect to the background density of the universe. And there's a set of equations, simple equations, at least in the linear regime, that allows us to measure or model, the evolutions of these fluctuations with time at each point. Okay, but then we know also that in some regions of the universe, these fluctuations would become large, right? So that this set of equations would not really be sufficient, right? And the main idea here is that in these regions, in some regions, the density, the physical density of that region, this is showing the typical spherical collapse model. It's gonna decrease in time, of course, because the universe is expanding, but it will do it at a rate that is slower than the whole background density of the universe. At some point, these fluctuations would actually decouple from the expansion of the universe, turn around and start collapsing, and ultimately they're gonna virialize and form the nonlinear structures that we call dark matter halos. And you know very well that these halos will merge hierarchically to form other halos as the universe expands and time goes by, right? The same process during this process, actually, these halos are gonna provide the potential wells necessary for gas and baryons to concentrate, cool, and collapse to form galaxies. And then we can observe, of course, thanks to galaxy surveys, this large-scale structure of the universe. But we know there's an intrinsic relation, obviously, with the dark matter halo, right? So the halo-galaxy connection, one of the things that we want to do is to understand these connections between the properties of galaxies and the underlying population of halos. But we want to do that not only in terms of their internal properties, but also their clustering properties, right? That's kind of like a key element in this field. So in that sense, you can imagine the universe, if you want, as composed of three different fields. The matter density field, which is a continuum field of dark matter, basically, your halo field, and your galaxy field. Probably in cosmology, here halos and galaxies are simple tracers of the matter density field. You're maybe not that interested in the internal properties of halos and galaxies, but in this halo-galaxy connection field, we also want to understand the relation between these fields and distribution, also as it pertains to dependencies on not only internal properties, but also local environments of these objects. And then you can define, obviously, your overdensities for these different fields. And we want to, from these overdensities, you also want to understand the clustering properties of this matter density field, halos, and galaxies. Okay. The most basic, I guess, measurement of clustering, which actually was shown there, is the correlation function that gives you the excess probability with respect to a Poisson, unclustered distribution of having two galaxies or two halos at a given scale, at a given distance, okay? So that's this excess probability there. And it's only natural, given that this hierarchical, merging of structures and the way the universe works, that this probability is going to be higher for smaller scales than for larger scales, and that's what is shown here. Now, it's going to be different between galaxies and dark matter halos, and that will allow me to introduce the next element here. But this picture here is quite consistent with what we know. All right, so now I have to introduce this concept of bias. In general, I'll be talking about large-scale linear bias, right? So you can express basically this bias allows you to connect your abundances of or density contrast of halos with things related to the matter density field, and this can come in terms of multiple operators here. Okay. The easiest way is to look at linear bias, which basically holds on large scales, and connect these overdensities of halos directly with the overdensities of matter, and the relation between those two is provided by this, is given by this linear bias, which, as I said, works on large scales only. This assumption here. Okay. So this, but maybe it's more intuitive. From this equation here, you can get to these other equations, right? That basically relate the correlation function of halos. This is the autocorrelation here, and matter, or even the cross correlations of halos and matter with the autocorrelation of matter, right? And from that first equation, you get to these other equations, and then the biases can be also seen as the relation, the ratio between correlation functions, basically. This you can define for halos, but also for galaxies, okay? So bias will give you how more correlated halos or galaxies are with respect to the matter density field, with respect to the correlation in the density peaks, basically. Right, so the motivations in this field, I guess you can boil it down to two. One of the main goals, the first one is cosmological motivation. One of the main goals of observational cosmology is to extract cosmological information from galaxy surveys, which, as I said before, use galaxies as bias tracers of the matter density field. So understanding those relations between bias and the properties of galaxies, halos, and local environment as well is going to be important. It's going to inform cosmology. The second one is, well, I guess it's more related to, it could be more related to galaxy evolution, because bias displays, as I said before, multiple dependencies on these internal and environmental properties. So it characterizes also the large-scale environments of different populations of galaxies, right? And here there's several, effects that probably you've heard of that I think bridge the gap between halo-galaxy connection and galaxy evolution, such as conformity. Daniela, for instance, is an expert on conformity, acidity bias, etc. I would recommend, if you have the time, to read this paper from Rita Tejero and Katarina Kraljic, where they actually address this type of connections, right? I like actually the title, Large-Scale Structure and the Cosmic Web, because in a sense, these are two approaches to measure the same thing. In galaxy evolution is more connected to cosmic web, where you actually look at different structures, the shape of structures, you define, your filaments, etc. Whereas large-scale structure here, it means, clustering. But there's an obvious relation between those two. Right? Okay, so also to remember some of the things that I did here with Raul and the group, I'm going to give you a few, some information on what we know, about halo bias, right? The first thing that, in terms of, as it pertains actually to the internal properties of halos, okay? So the first thing is that the main dependence of halo bias is halo mass. This comes directly or can be obtained directly from structure formation formalisms, and it means that more massive halos are going to have higher bias. They're more clustered on large scales than less massive halos, and that's something that is expected. But then in recent, I used to say recent years, now it's almost recent decades actually, we've been shown we've been characterizing secondary dependencies of halo bias as well. So that means that at a fixed halo mass, this is just normalized in a certain way, but this is mass basically, dimensionally. So at a fixed halo mass, you have differences in bias when you split your population by other secondary properties of halos, which could be spin, which is related to the angular momentum of the halos, or concentration, age, etc. There's almost any internal halo property that you can think of displays a certain level of secondary bias, as I call it here. Now, the term that you might be more familiar with is assembly bias, halo assembly bias. So that would be the dependence on properties that are directly connected to the assembly or accretion history of halos, okay? Such as typically, obviously, the half mass age of the halo. I can explain later how these properties are computed. And the other one is concentration, right? It's the typical or different definitions of age. Concentration, we know that's going to be related to the accretion history of halos, and that's usually called in the literature halo assembly bias. The secondary bias is a broader effect. This is maybe easier to see this way. This is some works that we did with Raul and the group. What I'm showing here is the relative bias for different populations defined based on C200, which is a concentration of the halo, at fixed halo mass. So this relative bias basically relates, the clustering of these subsets, low concentration, high concentration, with the clustering, well, in this case, the correlation function of the entire population at each beam of halo mass, okay? Meaning that if this relative bias is equal to 1, there's no secondary bias. You're splitting by a property that doesn't really produce any split on bias, right? If this is different from 1, then you get a certain level of assembly, in this case, secondary bias, or you could call it assembly bias here because you're talking about concentration. And with during my time here in Sao Paulo, we actually measured this for a number of properties. You get all kind of different signals. Here, this is actually the most famous one, as I said. This is the half mass scale factor that is related to the age of the halo, and this is the famous halo assembly bias signal. Okay, so this obviously you compute on a certain range of scales, but it has to be fairly large scale. So some people would laugh if you call this large scale. Anyways, okay, so a few years later, we still don't. I don't think we have a comprehensive picture of the physical mechanisms of assembly bias or secondary bias in general. It's something that really encompasses all the different trends. But we do have, I guess, a more clear picture, I would say, of the different elements that play a role here, right? So these different elements, you can boil it down to, I guess, 3 halo to halo interactions here. The fact that you are closer to a bigger halo, that can change your internal properties, right? And since you're closer to a bigger halo, the bias is going to be determined by that bigger halo. So that's going to affect your secondary bias. In general, cosmic web effects, this is related to the locations of halos within the cosmic web. That's going to affect your accretion history because of the whole geometry of the tides, right? You can imagine that if you're in a filament as compared to a node, your accretion is going to be different. In a filament, there's just a preferred direction as compared to a node, right? So the age of the halo is going to be different, and also that's going to affect separately the bias of this population. I mean, the location of halos in the cosmic web. And the other things that actually recently we worked with Sergio Contreras and some other people is the initial actually density field. I mean, if you go to the initial density field, this is just depicting the initial regions, right? And you try to measure properties of these regions, you realize there's already a certain level of secondary bias in the initial field as well. I mean, this is just characterized from from illustrious. I guess it's not really the initial field, but it's going back in time quite a lot. So a combination of all three, it will give you kind of like the physical origins of secondary bias. That was kind of introduction, so I don't know if I'm going to have time to say everything that I wanted to say. But anyway, so I wanted to talk about a few things that a few papers, very recent papers that kind of like can give you guys an idea of what I'm doing and my team as well, my group. I mentioned here this connection between bias and the cosmic web, you know. So it's only natural that we try to actually understand this connection in a little bit more detail. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the galaxy bias profile of cosmic voids as an example of this here. Oh, sorry. And here I have to introduce an estimate of halo bias that is particularly useful in this context, and it's called the halo by halo bias, or individual bias, sometimes it's called. There's actually a few other estimators that are similar, that are probabilistic, you know, but we're using a lot this one that was originally derived by Asim Paranjapi. And what it does is, like, well, you usually would, to compute the bias, you would have the whole population, and you would measure the correlation function related to the matter density field if it's the absolute bias, and then you will get a number, you know, for each population, you know. The difference here is that this individual bias isolates the contribution of each element, of each object in this case, to the large-scale bias of the whole population, okay? So that if you take the mean of this bias, you would recover what you would get from the traditional approach. But this is here very advantageous because it allows you to have a single value, you know, for each object. It's just kind of like, you know, metaphorically, you know, measuring what type of large-scale bias each object would see. So it's the contribution of each object to the large-scale bias of the population. So you can, with this type of estimators, you can actually plot things like this, which otherwise would be very hard, right? You can really assign a value of bias to each object. In this paper with Andrés Balaguer and Tolinas from the IAC, we actually studied this in quite a lot of detail in the context of secondary bias. This was actually also, you know, demonstrated by Paranjapi, but we show that you know, that mean of bias, this is the individual bias, would you know, would be in agreement with your, you know, your bias estimate, or the Tinker et al. Measurement from simulations using the standard approach, or even you can actually go to you know, whatever you preferred. Actually, it's not shown here, but if you look at the Sheth and Torment, whatever analytical bias estimate would follow the same trend for the mean of that individual bias. The other interesting thing here is that, you know, this individual bias gives you an idea of the internal variance, or stochasticity. I don't know if I want to use that word, but in you know, the internal variance of the estimate of the bias itself, because we know it's stochastic by definition. So this gives you an idea of that. That is, I think, pretty useful. So I need to give a shout out to one of my students, Constanza Soto, here, just promoting her work. He's actually working on, this is like individual bias, but separated by, you know, different structures, and she's looking at that, and oops, it went away. She's also trying to extend these estimates to other diagnostics of large-scale environments, like anisotropy of the environment. So you can extend this to other diagnostics on an object-by-object basis. Wanted to talk about cosmic voids. To see, this is kind of like an example with this individual bias is advantages. As you know, probably some of you know much more than me about this. Cosmic voids are these regions in the universe with densities of 10 to 20%, depends on the definition, the mean density of the universe. Their galaxies are special, apparently, although the literature here is quite deep, you know, but they should have a different galaxy population, fainter, bluer, later type morphologies. They are important cosmological probes, of course, And the thing is that this galaxy bias inside voids had not really been characterized almost, well, very well, but actually had not been characterized almost at all. You know, there's a few papers, but not too many. Right, so this is a paper that we wrote with recently with a bunch of people from Cordoba, Argentina, and also Daniela, Ravi, Ches, and we provide this measurement of the galaxy bias profile inside voids. That's a profile of the bias inside different type of voids, and this is a void, sorry, and this is something that you can do with this individual bias. So just quickly, what we did was, you know, we used TNG. Here we selected voids based on, based on this sparkling identification algorithm that basically defines spherical voids only. The other thing we did is to separate these voids into two types, following Ceccarelli et al. 2013. S-type voids are voids that actually are embedded in overdense large-scale regions. They are voids, but they are in regions that are not necessarily underdense, as is shown here. This is actually computed by you know, averaging on scales from 1 to 3 void radii, right? And this is as compared to what they call R-type voids. There are voids that are actually in underdense regions, okay? And as you can see here, now below the 0, the contrast of 0, so by definition it would be, this is the environment. It's kind of hard to but it would be voids that are inside you know, underdense regions. Oops. Yeah. This is our fiducial void sample. You know, this obviously, as you know, in void science, it depends a lot on the selection, the tracer sample that you use. You know, the definition of voids that you use is quite different. But well, this is what we got. That we also changed this selection to see that the profile wouldn't really change too much. We have voids from 5 to 20 megaparsecs of radii. This delta max is that over density average in the surrounding areas of the voids that we use to define these two types of voids, and this is the integrated over density inside the voids. I'm just going to show you a few highlights of this paper. This is what we measure. This is the average bias profile as a function of here the distance in physical units for 3 types of voids. This would be the largest voids, and this would be the smallest voids. This, of course, is not necessarily comparing apples to apples. So what we did here is to normalize to the distance to the void center. Sorry, to the void radius, right? So 1 would be if you are basically at the edge of the void here, right? And we found these profiles with this slope, particularly for the biggest voids, right? There's a very clear slope there, and for the smallest voids, the bias is significantly larger in general, and the profile is much more shallow or shallower. Okay, then when we separate it by R-type and S-type voids, we also find differences. This is expected, of course, because these guys here lie in overdense regions, large-scale regions, so you would expect that they have higher bias than these guys. What are the oh yeah, so the S-types lie within regions that are actually overdense. You know, R-types are embedded in regions that are actually underdense. So it's measured from this part of here. This is the profile of the voids, right? This is the overdensity. Okay, so if you integrate here, you know, in this region, okay, you're gonna be able, from 1 to 3, you're gonna be able to define the surrounding environment of these voids, right? Yeah. And of course, it makes sense, you know, but we also found that the slope is significantly steep. Well, not significantly, it's steeper for these S-type voids as well. This is quite related to some models of voids that Ravi worked on, but this is, but now we could actually, you know, confirm this. The other interesting highlight here is that one of the things that you could imagine or you could think is that you know, these voids have higher bias or lower bias because their halo population is different. That would be a possibility, right? You have massive you know, halos inside the voids or less massive, thinking that you know, the mass of the halo is the main determinant of bias. So you could expect a difference in bias, right? We checked, particularly here, for R-type, and S-type voids, that the halo profile, the halo mass profile inside the void is not too different for the two of them, right? So that means that that difference in bias occurs at a secondary bias level because the population of halos is similar in mass. So once you fix the environment, then you fix in the bias of these voids independently of, actually, the mass doesn't really play a role. Okay, so so now we are extending these measurements with a postdoc in Argentina at IATE, Germán Alfaro and a bunch of people there. You know, in Córdoba, many people work on void finders, you know, and there's all kind of flavors of void finders. The spherical ones, then Dante has these popcorn voids. Popcorn voids, as the name suggests, you basically add in different spheres, you know, like a popcorn, in order to be able to have shapes that are different from a sphere, you know, globally, right? And then you have other type of voids. So both are what they call watershed voids, etc. Right? So they're doing this analysis. And if you do that, there's, you know, you get different sizes of voids, you know, like it's shown here. This is the effective radius of the void, right? So some of these voids are not spherical anymore. So you have to have some sort of effective radius. And this would be the radius of the sphere that contains the same volume as the actual volume of the void that could be of any shape in reality. And then you have different density contrasts. Some of them are really weird. Well, I don't want to say weird, actually, because we are recording this. Some of them are special, you know, in the sense that they're not necessarily have overdensities that are negative, you know. But anyway, so what we're doing, what Germán is doing, is to see whether these these profiles, are at least relatively robust against variations in this void identification procedure. Yeah? And to some extent, they are, except for some of the void finders. But in general, you get a similar trend in bias, independently of the void finder to some extent. So this is interesting. We're also looking at how these can inform void finding algorithms. And then maybe the most interesting part of this is whether there's some sort of cosmological probe that can come out of this. Is there a dependence on cosmology for modified gravity models of the bias profile? We got some feedback in terms of possibly massive neutrinos impacting the profiles. You know, massive neutrinos suppress structure on smaller scales. So it could be that depending on the total mass of neutrinos, these profiles will change, etc. And the other interesting part is whether actually we can measure individual bias. This is a broader goal. But if we can measure individual bias observationally, we could do these things or even other things. It would open a different type of measurement, I guess, in cosmology. Okay, so I'm going to open a, no, that's not I don't know if that's an English expression, a parenthesis. Well. As a side note here, we've also looked at individual bias in the context of modified gravity. You know, so we have these modified gravity simulations, and we looked at variations in a bunch of different estimators, not estimators, but probes like secondary bias, the connection with environment, etc., for several modified gravity models. You know, with Jorge Garcia Farieta from Spain. We found small deviations, not very important, but when measured at fixed number density. If you measure things here at fixed mass, then you will find larger deviations. But of course, each model have different mass distributions. Once you do number density instead of mass, most of the deviations with lambda CDM would disappear. Okay, so that was the first part of the talk, and let me see if I can actually talk a little bit about how you can probe secondary bias observationally. All that I showed was mostly so far theoretical or using simulations, different types of simulations. And now the idea, that's something that I've been working on for a few years, is how we can probe these secondary bias dependencies. Again, these are dependencies at fixed halo mass that are related to clustering in one way or another, right? This is the most general term possible in this context. No? And the idea here is that you have a bunch of different measurements from simulations and secondary dependencies, some of which I have mentioned today, and it's very well characterized in simulations, at least characterized. Maybe in terms of the physical mechanisms that produce them, there's still work to do, but we have in every simulation that you use, you're gonna find this type of things. You know, so for halos, you have secondary bias and halo assembly bias, as I showed. If you look at central galaxies as a manifestation of secondary bias, you're also going to have dependencies at fixed halo mass on the properties of galaxies that are actually related to the properties of halos, like color and accretion history, for instance, right? And then maybe the measurement, or I guess the probe that has become the cornerstone in the galaxy assembly bias community is variations in HOD. In the HOD, this is what they call occupancy variation, right? Whether there are differences that can be associated to secondary halo properties in the HODs of galaxies, in the occupations, galaxy occupation of groups and or halos in general, right? As shown by Celeste Artale. I'd say there's mounting indirect evidence, but not consensus. Yet I can explain a little bit more about this in the questions. So I'm going to show you the first thing that I wanted to show you is a few papers that I've been writing with Facundo Rodriguez, also from Córdoba, from IATE. The first one is actually on simulation. So the idea here was to, I guess the question that we wanted to answer is that whether at fixed halo mass, I mean, if you look at central galaxies or halos at fixed halo mass, do you find differences or secondary bias differences with respect to when you look at the cosmic web? I mean, as a function of the cosmic web in one way or another, right? We used here disperse, that as you probably know, this is a way of measuring and characterizing the density field, right? And it gives you basically the critical points of the density field. Not only that, it gives you the skeleton of filaments, but also the critical points, saddle points, nodes, minima, etc. And what we did was to, again, at fixed halo mass, measure secondary bias as a function of the distance to these critical points, right? Like nodes, filaments. This is again close, far from nodes, filament points, and different types of saddles, right? You expect to some extent, obviously, that there are differences in bias because you are conditioning by something that is related to the structure itself. But the idea is to see how much signal there is, because it could also happen that, you know, when you're closer to one of these structures, you're going to be maybe more massive or whatever, or less massive. So maybe the signal remaining, it doesn't have to be that large in reality. Yeah. But we found very, very large signals, as large as it has been found in terms of secondary bias when doing this, okay? And then, well, in the paper, we explain the connection with assembly bias, many other things that I really don't have much time to explain, but that I can do in the question session. So the next step, this is a paper that will come out next week. I wanted to try this thing that that people do, like they say, you know, this paper has actually come out today, you know, when they're giving a talk, but I said, it doesn't matter. So next week it's going to come out. This is actually trying to measure these things in the SDSS using also disperse, right? So we applied disperse to the SDSS and did the same game, basically. So we also used, we need a group catalog to do this. So we need to characterize our halos. We used Rodriguez and Marchand, Facu's method, applied to the latest data release, so one of the latest of the SDSS. This is a refined catalog which allows us to go to smaller or lower halo masses. And you get, well, this is a hybrid method. It uses friends of friends, but also, you know, a halo-based method. And we also, well, it uses abundance matching to get your halo masses, right? So here's the trend that we found for color. I showed it before. It's that for color in hydrodynamical simulations, we find these type of trends. So fixed group mass. This is the relative bias between redder and bluer galaxies. And you can see right here that there is a difference. It's small, but that's the constraint that you get observationally on secondary bias. This has been shown some way before in different ways, but I think not as clear as here, where you have halo mass and a difference, you know, fixed halo mass and a difference in bias so strong. Well, it's not strong, but it's clear for red and blue galaxies. Yeah. That is something that is expected. And then, how much time do I have left? Right away. 10 minutes? Okay. Yeah, and then we tried the same game that we did before, like looking at secondary bias based on the distances to nodes, filament walls, minima. Here we got qualitatively similar results, quantitatively different in reality. There's a lot of discussion here. For instance, for some reason, for saddles, we get basically no signal whatsoever. When we measure it for wall saddles, these are saddle points in 2D regions, walls, right, between voids. We literally get no difference in bias when using that as a reference point for secondary bias, whereas in simulations we got a very large signal here. But in general, we could find these dependencies that again, I don't think they have been actually shown observation. We also looked at the density. This is also something that you would expect. This is the overdensity. This is separating your population by overdensity. By the way, what I'm showing here are different ways of defining your subsets in terms of 30% subsets or just half, you know, 50 and 50. And with density, we did find the largest secondary bias signals. Again, this is something that you would expect, but you know, is confirmed here. Well, this plot here shows the significance of the bias difference. This is called intra-beam bias difference. Basically, here what we're doing is taking calculating the mass, the average mass of each subset that we're using, and computing the bias using different analytical estimators like Sheff and Torment that you would expect, you know, assuming that mass is the only determinant of halo bias, right? And since the masses of the two subsets are very small, these differences are minimal, really, meaning that you know, it's not that inside a being, you know, you have more massive or less massive halos, and that's producing your separation in bias. No, because that wouldn't be the case unless you took the whole being literally. That's what is shown here, the whole being of mass, and this would be the extreme, right? Anyway, so we also came up with this hierarchy of signals, you know, where again, you know, this has different ranges. So the density is the property that produces a largest secondary bias. What is the connection with assembly bias? So halo assembly bias, as I mentioned before, is the secondary dependence of halo bias on halo accretion history at fixed halo mass, you know. Here, central galaxy color is a proxy. I mean, I think this is fair to say that it's a proxy for the accretion history of halos. We haven't done this properly, you know. You could actually do this in a simulation, but there are several results pointing toward that direction that are known, right? So central galaxies group, what we did is to actually measure the distribution of colors for the subsets defined in terms of these cosmic web environments estimated, right? So central galaxies or group in denser environments tend to be redder, central galaxies or groups closer to saddles and nodes also tend to be slightly redder, not by a lot in reality, but there's some signal there. So the picture here is that, as predicted from simulations, the local cosmic web environment can be seen as a mediator between large-scale bias and the internal halo properties. So the idea is that your location within the cosmic web is going to determine, your bias, and that location is going to be correlated with galaxy properties and potentially with halo properties as well. So that gives you a picture to kind of understand assembly bias, again, as something that can be mediated. I mean, like bias is going to be mediated by this environment, or the internal properties and bias are mediated by environment, as suggested by Paranjab in 2018. Okay, so I probably have like 5 minutes, I guess. So I'm going to just go quickly here. The other thing that we've done recently is to try to probe this spin bias signal. This is a similar thing, but in this case, this again simulations. You're separating your halos by the spin parameter of the halo. So this is high spin halos. This is low spin halos. We characterize this very well with simulation. We even know what's causing this inversion. And then the idea was to look at a probe, observational probe for this. This is something that I told my colleague at USM, Rory Smith, and it was like a hold my beer type of moment. And well, Rory came out. They had work on this spin orbit coherence proxy for halo spin. I'm just gonna explain it quickly. But the idea that they showed in simulations is that the coherent motions of satellites or neighbors of a halo is related actually to the amplitude or the magnitude of the spin or the spin parameter of the halo, right? And in simulations, it works, and using this proxy, you can reproduce this spin bias, this proxy of spin. You can reproduce a spin bias signal in simulations. So what we did was to try to, I'm going to go quickly here. We applied this to the SDSS, and still is not really a super strong measurement, right? But by separating in SDSS our clusters by this spin proxy, we do get something similar to the spin bias signal that has been. Go for it. Yeah.
What is the spin proxy then?
Yeah. Sorry. This. Yeah. Because I'm thinking that I have to finish now. Yeah, the spin proxy is this thing. So you look at the tangential velocities of the satellites, or you could even take whatever is around, These, yeah. Just the velocity, the line of sight velocity coming from the SDSS, yeah. And then, well, if there's no coherence, that's going to be, the average is going to be 0, But if there is some sort of coherence, that's not going to be 0. If there's no coherence, there's going to be as many objects. It's going to be completely random, right?
So the variable velocity, an average of the velocity between the halo and the convection and the momentum is like r squared times the velocity. So they are weighted differently according to the halo. You're using the same velocity therefore.
Yeah.
The virial velocity is just
no.
based on mass.
The virial velocity is to kind of, well, to take it, to normalize by mass somehow.
Okay.
And also because if you look at the spin, actually the spin parameter is normalized. It's an I-dimensional, there's mass here as well. So we realized we have to divide somehow by in this case, the virial velocity we chose, but to normalize by mass. Otherwise, it wouldn't work that well. And this is analogy. It's an analogy to the spin parameter. Yeah.
But the virial velocity is completely the same.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Well, and the thing is that we separated by this spin proxy, right? And then we did the clustering and everything. And of course, this is, again, the error bars are quite close to each other. But it's the beginning, I think, of a probe. Actually, the cool thing is that whatever you do to this model. I mean, because you can change the velocity cut, as you can imagine, the scale of the correlation function, anything. The shape is going to change, but always the red line is going to be on top of the blue line. So in that sense, it's consistent. I mean, it's not significantly strong, but it's quite robust in a sense, you know, as compared to, you know, against different changes in the model. Okay, so I'm going to finish here. I have to give another shout out to a student, Ignacio Quiroz, who's working with me and Rory. He's trying to improve this spin proxy using, of course, machine learning. The idea is that this can go beyond, of course, spin bias, but can also be used for, you know, galaxy evolution studies, etc. If we can really refine this spin proxy, so you can imagine, you know, studying you know, how the properties of galaxies change for different halos separated by spin and all these things. And finally, Catalina Riveros, I need to give a shout out to her as well. She's kind of like the third installment of the machine learning, this machine learning trend that we studied with Raul, Natalie, Natalia, and now Kata, that sometimes we call her Katali because of Natalie, you know, because she's so interested in machine learning. Yeah, and she's actually including this, hopefully she's going to continue also working with us and with Raul as well. She's including this, what is it here, this individual bias into this machine. Now we can include it into a machine learning framework because it's an individual value, or it's easier. Anyways, and also Vicente Izzo, who's working on a bunch of things, but he's got an interesting paper studying the variation, actually the invariance of group occupation across the cosmic web. It's almost accepted. And that's all. This is a take-home message. It's a very general take-home message, mostly for the Halo Galaxy connection. I want to reiterate that it's very nice to be here. I really am enjoying this week. And anyways, I hope I can come back more often. And thank you very much, and I'll take questions now.
Thank you, Antonio. Questions?
When you show the bias in the void profiles,
Yeah.
When you show the bias in the void profiles, I think you show a negative bias for the S-type voids. Can you help me to interpret it? Like, why is it negative? I thought like cosmological is just the ratio between 2-point correlation functions, right? And they're usually the same sign.
But usually, yeah, voids have negative bias, right? It's something that it sounds a little weird, but it can be negative, right? I mean, those overdensities can be perfectly negative. I mean, if you think about bias as the overdensities of halos and overdensities of matter.
Yes, but matter is negative. Delta for matter is negative, and delta for galaxies should be negative as well, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. But I guess, yeah.
well, the overabundance of a void is the abundance of an axis. So
I think it has to somehow cancel, so it gets only one negative. But that's a good point. But it's something that it's common in this, right? I mean,
But
I think
yeah,
Raul, you might.
it was only on the S-type voids, so yeah, maybe.
Which are the ones
Yeah,
in very underdense regions, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
can you show it again? Because my memory is that both were negative, but one was more negative.
One is more negative than the other. Yeah, you're right. One is very negative, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. No.
Oh no, there you go. This one is actually positive. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because that's the one that you're choosing in overdense regions, right?
Exactly. It's almost it's not a tautology, but it's you know, yeah, you would expect it. But yeah, this is something that you really expect. In all the models, void models of bias, the bias of at least the, if I'm correct, the biggest voids is negative, right?
Yeah. So the blue one means that you are choosing a region that has an overdensity in matter. Delta of matter is positive. In the second one, delta of matter is negative. Right? So
Oh yeah.
in cases have a negative matter.
But you do have galaxies in there.
Yeah, sure.
So that would make it negative, I guess, because the overdensity of matter is positive. Yeah, I think it does make sense. Yeah, but it's a little, it could be a little confusing if you think about the, yeah.
More questions?
Go to the previous slide.
This one?
no.
More previous?
One with the masses.
Ah, yeah. Okay. This one?
Okay. No.
Which masses?
No,
There's a lot of masses. Yeah.
The one that you have shown.
This one?
I want to see one with a mass scale in the x-axis. Oops.
This is a
No,
distance in the
distance.
x-axis. Maybe it's in a different paper of the ones that I showed. Well, this is the effective radius. There's so many things.
Okay.
There's so many things as a function of
Yeah.
mass.
For example, this one. The object exploded. Central galaxies. But how is it possible a central galaxy with a mass 10 to the 14.5 or 10 to the 14?
No. Yeah, this is the virial mass of the halo where these central galaxies live, right?
Okay. So
you could also do this with stellar mass. You also will get some signal, but it would be you wouldn't call it assembly bias. You always have to have.
Okay. No, my point is, you can do the analysis using the halo as a whole, as apparently you are doing, or by considering the mass of the galaxy itself, because the galaxy is a subhalo.
Yeah, I mean, you could put here stellar mass, or I don't know if I actually. I mean, I would expect a signal as well, because the particular. I guess, because the mass of the central galaxy is going to be related to the halo mass. It's not going to be exactly the same, but there's going to be some sort of signal there. At least in this context, people don't do it because the idea is to do things fixed halo mass in the context of assembly bias. But that would be interesting to do, and certainly more observationally possible. But still, you can get halo, group masses as well from observations, with some uncertainties.
Okay, thank you.
Other question?
Hi, Antonio. Thanks for your talk. I wondering from the observational perspective, I got very lost most of the time. But when you talk about the spin of the halos from the observational point of view, how do you determine the velocities or the spin? You mentioned is line of sight velocity, but you need the angle to really know the velocity and the spin. Otherwise, you could have zero velocities, but only because it is in the plane of the sky. So how do you deal with that?
I don't know if I followed. Oh no, but there's nothing. Yes, thanks. There has to be a line of sight velocity, otherwise, of course, if it's rotating on the plane, there's nothing to do. But then there's no line of sight velocity for those one, right? Yeah. In that case, observationally, you wouldn't get anything. Yes.
Yeah. So you have.
In a simulation, you can put whatever line of sight. Yeah.
Yeah, but from observation, you could have zero velocities in your line of sight, but there will be a spin in reality. So how do you deal with that? You show many plots.
Yeah, but you would expect that you would have as many high spin as low spin objects orientated that way, in principle, So that should cancel off, I guess, when computing your bias. You see, because it's an orientation thing. You would expect that the strength of the spin would not depend on the particular line of sight, right? You see what I mean? So then it would not, Of course, there's gonna be objects there that actually have a spin that you cannot measure, but that should affect the two subsets equally, right?
So you look for the maximum velocity.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good point, though.
Other question? If there is no other question, please, thanks again.
Sure.